In any list like this, there's always going to be a game at the very bottom, and a lot of the times, that's not always the easiest choice in the world, but thankfully, I do not find this to be one of those times. I think Trails of Cold Steel 4 is a disaster in every sense of the word. There's so much to say here. From some of the most unbalanced and mind-numbing boss encounters this series has ever had, to the fact that this game is constantly forcing you to use characters that are completely out of your control, be it their equipment, arts, or orbits. I think your selection of playable characters is one of the most important things in an RPG, but very few of the characters in this game actually feel like party members. Most of them just feel like they're playable just so the game can advertise itself as having 39 playable characters. But when most of them will never learn any new skills or have any degree of customization that goes into them, it feels so bad when you are constantly being forced to use them. Nothing feels worse in an RPG than when for the most part there is literally no reason to interact with any of the mechanics. Because why should anybody even bother with leveling up certain characters, equipping anyone with orbments, or even putting any thought whatsoever into the team composition at all, when you can literally just do nothing and get the exact same value just doing whatever and having the game constantly forcing you to play by its rules? It feels less of an RPG and more of an interactive experience where you are constantly being railroaded all for the sake of the quote-unquote hype of having all of these characters as playable. I'm not even remotely against the idea of a large playable roster, quite the opposite in fact. But if you're going to have all of these characters and market them as playable, you need to kind of do the work and have them actually interact with the game's mechanics. You want to bring back Estelle and Joshua and have them be playable? Fine. You want to bring back the SSS? Fine. You want Scrimblow Bimblow, the lovable mascot from the 6th game in the series? Even better. Heck, even throw in a bunch of characters that haven't been playable at all. But if you're going to do that, make sure they can level up, learn new skills, use different orbments, use different arts. Don't just throw them into my party and force me to use them against a boss fight where I have literally no say in any of their equipment. It doesn't feel good beating the boss like that. It just feels like the game held my hand and said, this is how you win. And if it were just a 1 or 2 time thing where they force me to use a cameo character, that's fine. But the fact that this game is literally littered with boss encounters, we are going to be doing that all throughout the game and most egregiously at the end game, it just ruins the whole experience for me. I'm not really going to talk too much about the plot here because frankly, outside of it feeling kind of contrived in order for there to be a reason that all these past characters are now here and playable, there are some pretty sweet character moments and it's a nice continuation of the series as a whole. But seriously, if you're just playing through the series and want to get to the next game, there's a part of me that recommends just skipping it and watching the cutscenes on YouTube because there is nothing to actually justify playing this one. It is rushed, it is lazy, and it is not worth your time. Alright, I promise I'll be nicer from here on out, I just had to get all that off my chest first. Okay, so unlike the last one, I actually do have some nice things to say about Trails Through Daybreak. Firstly, I think the new engine use here is fantastic. It looks great, it feels extremely clean to play. I love a lot of the new mechanics and concepts introduced here, the whole system of field battles that lead into the encounters that take place on the world map themselves. It's nothing short of super cool. And also, I want to add, after this many games, it is about time that you can freely move and use skills in the same turn. Everything about this game really just does feel so fresh. I also like that they sort of quasi-merged the orbit systems from both earlier on in the series and the Cold Steel games, but with a new twist on it. You still put on specific arts and stat bonuses like in the Cold Steel games, but different combinations of different elements apply different skills that take place in battle, so there is more of an incentive for different combinations like in the Sky and Crossbow games. There is so much here that I do like, and I still am excited for future games in the series because I do think elements like these would be so much fun in a good game. Because at the end of the day, even with all of these cool features that I like, I still just don't like this game. Which is a shame because realistically, there is so much here that it just feels so bad that the game never takes advantage of any of these cool systems. It's one of those cases, like with Cold Steel 4, where I feel like a bad RPG is one where it never feels compelling, rewarding, or even slightly validating to actually interact with any of its systems on more than a superficial level. Because even on the hardest difficulty, when none of the encounters feels like there's ever any reason to optimize your characters or use a new positioning system in a cool or meaningful way, these systems that I think look really cool on paper, they just feel like a chore. This game is absolutely a huge case of them just not designing the encounters around the systems that they introduced. It feels like they designed the bosses and the combat system, and then after all of that was over, then they decided to add some cool mechanics. I can't think of a single fight that wasn't extremely boring, because this game does nothing to push these limits or even come close to it. They just feel like they're kind of there. And if you take any amount of pre-planning into account, there is literally nothing in this game that will remotely pose a threat to you. If I can play a game for the first time blind on nightmare difficulty and just breeze through every boss encounter first try like it's nothing, then it's a bad video game. I should have to think and strategize and work with the systems to take down the bosses, rather than just do the bare minimum and have nothing pose a threat. And that's not me saying I'm some kind of god gamer, because I'm definitely not, but rather that this game is so poorly designed on a mechanical level that everything I do think is cool about this game may as well not even exist. But at the end of the day, if that was the worst of it, then I could probably forgive it all. I don't think it'd be a very good video game, but at least I would not have the level of distaste I have for this one, if the pacing of the story wasn't actually atrocious this time around. Featuring by far the worst side quest this series has ever had to offer. So many times throughout the game's narrative will everything just come to a screeching halt so that you can do 4 SPGs, which basically means wandering around talking to an NPC for 45 minutes while you fight maybe 1 or 2, once again, extremely simple and boring enemies. This happens dozens of times throughout the game, and it never gets any better. I have never been a fan of a lot of the content in the series that pretty much just boils down to talking to NPCs to complete quests, and it is at its absolute worst here. Overall, easily the most disappointing game in the series for me, and not even on a technical balancing level like Cold Steel 4 was. This game was just boring and bland. If I'm saying another positive thing about this game, though, I really do like the setting and the characters. I really vibe with Vanessa's protagonist, and I am excited to see where the story goes from there. And once again, like I said, I really do love a lot of the ideas introduced here, so I still am excited for the next game, albeit maybe a little reluctantly. But, you know, I believe in second chances. Now moving on to the point where I am going to have to start putting some more thought into these rankings, because from here on out, there really are no more that I genuinely dislike as a whole, but I definitely still feel like there are games that feel sort of lower end compared to the rest of the series. Trails from Zero feels like a slightly more refined version of the Trails in the Sky games, so much so that it felt awful to go from the final game in that trilogy to basically starting completely over. It doesn't really do anything to stand on its own, which wouldn't even be bad if it didn't just feel like it was throwing everything you had in Sky 2 and the third out the window so that you could just start all over again with the most basic of skills and customization. Playing through the series in order, nothing felt so bad as going from feeling like you have the world at your fingertips in Sky the Third to having to go back and equip Fire 1 on Attack 1 and unlock everyone's orbits from the start again. And don't get me wrong, I completely understand that in a series as long running as this, you kind of do need to do that to an extent, but I more so would have preferred them just shaking up a bit after 3 games, so it didn't just feel like the previous 3 games but worse, and that you were missing out. Or at least try to have it flow into the next game a little better, so that it doesn't feel as jarring, but I get it. Also, going from like the 16 party members in Sky 3rd to only having 4 is like, what the heck? Now, I totally get and am in favor of the idea of quality over quantity, but here, it really doesn't feel like you're getting either quality or quantity. Outside of a few of their crafts and their role that they play in the battles themselves, there really isn't anything that interesting about the way any of them play, at least in Zero. And I kind of just feel like if there was any game where you were going to have the characters really stand out in combat, it would be here, where there is only 4 members. But no, once again, just like the orbit systems, it just feels like everything we had up to this point, but worse and more limited. Even from a story and character perspective, I feel that way about the SSS. You would think that with such a small cast of characters, they would at least feel or be written in a way that makes them feel like a group, but none of these characters really have any sort of characterization or interactions that isn't with Lloyd. I swear, I feel like characters like Randy, Tio, and Ellie talk more to each other in the Cold Steel games than they do in their own game. I feel like none of these characters exist outside of their relationship and interactions with Lloyd. Just try and name one scene where 2 characters not named Lloyd have a meaningful interaction or a character moment. You can't do it. Neither can I. This game is also where this series really started leaning into the idea of progressing the story through mindless side quests. While it's not as bad here as it is later on, for instance Trails through Daybreak, it just feels so formulaic. Every chapter is just doing menial tasks and talking to NPCs throughout the week, and they just finish it off with a story dungeon. I don't know why the series is so afraid of letting you interact with the combat. Coming in with our first original trilogy game, Trails in the Sky 2nd Chapter is a game I've sort of gone back and forth with in the past, but honestly, I really don't have much to say about this one. It's very far from my favorite in the series, but I guess it's still kind of solid in its own right. There's nothing that I think that this one does too terribly or bad, aside from maybe some of the annoying boss balancing. I mentioned earlier that I'm a fan of the orbit system in these earlier titles where you apply different elemental combinations in order to use varying levels of skill. I think that's fun, I think that's solid. I think the only reason that I am putting it below the first game is the fact that I am just not a fan of the sort of maybe last 10 hours of this one. I find it incredibly annoying, the section where you really can't use arts. But I do think the final dungeon and a lot of the boss fights there do make up for it. I don't know, just one of those games that I feel like is just middle of the road. And I really do feel that way about the next couple of games on this list. And while this might just be a me problem, I really do despise the direction they ended up taking Estelle and Joshua's relationship in this series. I was a fan of Estelle as a protagonist in the first game before they decided to assassinate her character by having her go full-on incest on her adopted brother. I really enjoyed the sibling bond in the first one, and I feel like by throwing that away, they sort of devalued the whole concept of their found family and just turned it into a very uncomfortable romance plot. Was there really anything so wrong with them just staying siblings and loving each other in that way? I don't know. I cite this game and that big reason as one of the reasons I'm so sick of seeing Estelle brought back time after time again in the series. I just hate what they did to her in this one, and I'm sick of seeing it. Speaking of the first one, I'm going to place it just a little bit higher, just above the sequel. Very close to it, but I do think I ended up preferring this one just a bit more. Trails in the Sky is the game that started it all, so by comparison, it does just seem a little lacking compared to the 10 or so games that come after it, but I do think that it does have its own charm in a way. Like always, I do find the original orbit system to be incredibly solid, even though this is its first instance. I will say it was kind of annoying, only really having 2 to 3 characters at a time for most of the game, as I feel like this game's battle system really shines when you have the full squad going, but they sort of justify it from a narrative standpoint. The whole final section of this game, however, starting with the tournament and through the end, is honestly really fantastic, and I really feel like it ties the whole thing together, and that's definitely why I have it over the second game. Now for the next 2 games, I am just going to lump them together because I'm not even sure that I could physically rank them separately. I could sit here and come up with some contrived reason as to why Cold Steel 1 is better or Cold Steel 2 is better, but really anything I say or any sort of justification that I come up with would probably just be a lie. I mentioned in the Trails from Zero segment that it felt really bad to go from the End of Sky, the third, and basically have to start all over with the exact same system, and if this game had gone down that route, I can tell you that they would have been placed much lower for sure. While yes, you are starting over at level 1 with low-level crafts and arts, I feel as if the games do enough to mix it up and stand on their own from previous entries, to the point where it doesn't really bother me. If I'm being honest, at the time I got to these games, I was kind of disappointed with a lot of the changes. Like for one, I infinitely prefer the original orbit system. I mean, now I do feel like it ends up being the right choice, just because it fits a little better into what's to come. That, and I think it would have been completely miserable to start from zero for the 3rd time. Wait, is that why they call it that? However, one of the negatives that does come along with switching up a lot of the systems like these, you kind of unfortunately do lose a bit of the refinement that just comes with being the 6th game in a series. Like, if I could put my feelings into words here, it did feel like a bit of a downgrade without the added additions of mechanics that later made me appreciate this change. So while I do kind of think that some of the changes were necessary for the series to stay fresh and continue, there isn't really enough to a lot of them in these 2 games. However, I do really feel like these games are very structurally sound. I think the pacing is some of the best that the series has ever had. And I honestly feel like this is where they really started nailing the character writing a lot better. I feel like the developers realized that, at least in the case of Zero, and by extension Azure, the characters didn't really exist outside of their relationship with Lloyd. And I feel like they went to work overtime to characterize Class 7 much better. There is ample time dedicated to everyone as individuals as well as pairings. The characters all feel much more real when they're allowed to exist outside of their relationship with Rean. They have friends, they're in clubs, they like and dislike other members of the class. It just feels real. And honestly, I have no problem saying that Class 7 is by far my favorite cast of characters this series has ever had. And I think this game does a fantastic job of introducing them, and what's to come. Trails into Azure is the ultimate culmination and refinement of the systems the series had been using for 5 games in a row, and it's nice to see that they send it off with a high note before mixing things up and moving into the Cold Steel saga. This game is pretty much what I would call Trails from Zero if it was good. I feel like they took everything, not just from Zero, but also the Sky games, and they refined it all so well. One of my bigger complaints about Zero was that it actually kind of babied the player. I feel like this game does a better job of actually asking the player to interact with its systems, which is not as common for this series as I would hope. They give you more playable characters, a higher degree of customization. Trails from Zero might have had you feel like you were starting over, but I feel like this game does a good job of speeding ahead to at least stand where it should be as the 5th game of the series. It also isn't as annoying to play. I feel like there's a lot less of an emphasis on walking to and from the different cities of Crossbell. The side quests are a little more interactive in this one. They're actually more battling, less babbling. And I also feel like the difficulty was to a better point, closer to the later Sky games, which is something I very much appreciated. In Zero, I maybe game overed 1 or 2 times, and that's probably because I opened up a high-level chest on accident. No, but this game had me constantly losing and having to reconfigure my strategy, which is something I really like about RPGs. There's still the SSS problem I talked about in the Zero segment, but honestly I think they did take a few steps to sort of change that for the better. There's at least a few scenes now between non-Lloyd characters that I can actually remember, which at the end of the day is really all that I'm asking for. I think the Crossbell duology does kind of suffer in a way, at least in my eyes, because there is only 2 games, and that means I kind of see half of them as not being very good. But you know what, at least it ends on a decently high note, not just for the Crossbell games, but for the first part of the series as a whole. Ending on this high note really helped me to look back fondly on Crossbell as a whole later on in the series. Alright, everything from here on out are the games that I love. The games that I believe to be the golden standard for the series, and the ones I easily view as the best that the series has to offer. And if you've been paying attention, you can probably guess what they are. I don't care what anybody says. Trails of Cold Steel 3 is great. Easily the best Cold Steel game in my eyes, and frankly, it's not even close. If Sky 3rd is the game that made me fall in love with the series, this is the game that completely reinvigorated that love. This game takes all of the new systems introduced in the first 2 Cold Steel games and completely and utterly expands upon it. New things like the break system are added, which adds an extra layer of strategy to the combat, as well as a completely revamped and rebalanced link system. I love what they did with Brave Points, and I think the inclusion of Brave Orders is the best thing to ever have come out of this series. It is just so much fun using all of the different characters and seeing how their Brave Orders interact with one another, as well as their crafts and arts. They locked the heck in while making this one, and frankly, it shows. I haven't even mentioned the fact that it is one of the games in the series where you do kind of have to start fresh, like you do in Zero, the first Cold Steel, and Daybreak. Because frankly, I am just so unbothered by it here. I didn't feel like it matters. I didn't feel like I started over. I feel like I started fresh. This game really is the game that introduced a lot of the mechanics and the systems and basically the overall gameplay loop/style that when I think about the Legend of Heroes Trails series, this is what I think about. This right here is absolutely my favorite era and style of Trails games, and it is so disappointing that I don't like Cold Steel 4 as much as I do, because frankly, Cold Steel 3 through Reverie could have been a generational run for the series. Returning to Thor's University as a professor at the branch campus felt wonderful, and the setting and characters there were so interesting. Seeing the growth of Class 7 in the world was also great as well. This is the first game in the series before Reverie that I actually 100% and filled out all the logs because I was just so into it. It's just a shame that it was followed up in the actual worst way possible. Oh well, but at least I'll always have this one. For the longest time, I really did think that Trails in the Sky III would always be my favorite game in the series, and pretty much up until I played the final game on this list, it really was. I mean, I did enjoy the first 2 Sky games for the most part when I was playing through the series, but they never really clicked with me that hard. I was really only playing through the series just out of sheer curiosity. But this is the game that made me fall in love with the series, and it is where I decided to see things through to the end. You can tell right from the start that it's not really like the other 2 Sky games. This time you actually play as Kevin Graham, who is easily my favorite character in the series, by the way, and you are almost immediately thrust into a literal manifestation of Gehenna, alongside pretty much every other playable character you have come to know over the last 2 games, and your only objective is to survive the upcoming trials and escape. Now personally, I really am just a huge fan of dungeon crawlers, and I think that's probably one of the main reasons that this game resonated with me so hard in that sense, because that is pretty much what this game is. There's no unfun side quests, the game rarely railroads your party, and all you're basically doing is proceeding through the different levels of hell, battling bosses, and trying to make it all the way to the end. I really like that this was much more of a boss rush game than the first 2, and I feel like that really lends itself well to the setting and overall loop that they were going for with this one. As you make it further and further into the game, you recruit more characters to the cause, and you are given complete freedom as to how they're equipped, how they're set up, who you bring, and what your strategy is for every single one of the many challenging boss fights. This is already, in my opinion, the best gameplay loop the series has ever had to offer, and it is paired with some fantastic side content. Rather than talking to NPCs and doing menial tasks for them to get bracer points or whatever, pretty much all of the side content in this game requires you to beat a certain boss or finish some challenge or reach some other milestone or parameter. Doing so unlocks one of the many doors found all throughout Hell. Whether the door is a minigame with useful rewards that will help you in later combat, short stories that provide excellent characterization for your characters, or cutscenes that set up later games and plot points. Some of them even have their own boss battles or mini dungeons to complete as well. It is 100% worth it to hunt each and every one of them down for the full experience. I also found Kevin's introspective journey here to be fantastic, and I think that this game has some of the best thematic writing in the series. I cannot stress enough how much of an improvement this game is over the previous two, and how it remains on top until... The Legend of Heroes Trails into Reverie is my favorite game in the entire series, and honestly, on a good day, maybe even in my top 10 RPGs of all time. Even though I was kind of lukewarm after being so miserable playing Cold Steel 4, hearing fans who have played the Japanese release of Reverie compare it to a modern-day Sky III immediately piqued my interest. And honestly, that pretty much does just sum up what I really love about this game. It sort of takes the boss rush dungeon crawling mentality from Sky III, while giving you 34 more characters in that game to pick from, having over 50 characters total, and it gives each and every single one of those characters their own sense of customization and progression. I mean, it's crazy. Having over 50 characters, all with their own crafts and brave orders, you could fight every single boss in that game. Not just you could fight every single encounter in that game, with a different combination of characters. And I completely think this game succeeds where Cold Steel 4 failed, because it actually spends the effort to make each character actually feel like a party member in this RPG. Being able to actually customize their equipment, loadouts, arts, orbments. This is how you're supposed to do a game with a larger roster. And this is kind of where I mentioned earlier, in talking about the first two Cold Steel games, where I kind of do think the change to a more simple orbment system was kind of for the better. Because here, with this many characters, it really does allow a little more breathing room when it comes to changing your characters. Yes, I really do like and prefer the older system in a lot of ways, but I think with a cast this large, it's a lot better for just quick changing on the fly. It allows me to look for characters to use based off of their brave orders and maybe some of their crafts rather than their stats and a lot of their orbment limitations. I think both systems work really well, but I think this game just excels so much in its own identity. And yeah, sure, maybe some of the characters do feel a little bit of the samey, but that is just going to happen in a game like this, and it doesn't even matter to me because I'm just so thankful that they actually went the extra mile to really justify having this many playable characters and combinations. Basically, it's just nice that it never feels like I'm being railroaded because each character is an actual RPG party member and not just a plot device. So even on some of the boss fights in the routes outside of the Reverie corridor, it still feels like I, as the player, am in control of how I set up my team for the fight. Speaking of the true Reverie corridor, it is also my favorite dungeon in any video game ever. Once again, I am a fan of dungeon crawling RPGs, and it sort of fulfills the same concept as Gehenna does from Sky III, where it is a giant maze with lots of bosses over and over again. It's also randomly generated this time around, so it feels like you can just run it over and over again with different combinations of characters to get them items and to level them up as many times as you want to. It is also so rewarding to spend time in the corridor because there are a multitude of quests that give points that you can spend to upgrade your overall stats or different bonuses in combat to maybe play through the game a little bit better. The gameplay loop is literally so absurdly good, I might even prefer it over Sky III, even if there is a little bit more of the restrictions when it comes to being outside the corridor. The whole system of the optional content through doors returns in the form of little orbs that you get by defeating different bosses on different floors of the corridor. It's really fun whenever you unlock a new sector of the dungeon to pretty much go and collect them all by defeating all of the bosses. Once again, these orbs can pretty much be anything from a minigame that provides good rewards, a little mini-story you can play through, a short story providing great characterization, cutscene setting up future elements in the Calvard arc, or providing closure to some of the series' many characters so far. That, and you also can get some gray orbs which will provide different clothing accessories. I'm always a big fan of dressing up my characters. And the best part is that you can completely randomize the dungeon whenever you want. You just go to the home base and just rearrange it all through the terminal. I spent hours in there just rearranging it and running through it with different sets of characters and taking down the boss fights with different combinations. It's just a blast. And it always feels worth it because the items you get are specifically catered to those you bring in, so it's fun just going through it with different characters just to get their super weapons and also different clothing options for them. Like I mentioned, there is the main story featuring the 3 different playable routes that takes place outside of the corridor for those who really weren't too happy with the enclosed nature of Sky the Third. And while it's still really good, I would have been perfectly fine if the entire game took place in the corridor. I was that into it. I had so much fun with it that even weeks after beating the main story, I was still running it back with different characters and doing all the optional post-game content for even better rewards. And not to mention a lot of the super bosses. I really feel like it takes the core gameplay loop from Sky the Third and just completely expands upon it with all the new features from Cold Steel 3 that I really love, and it is just like the dream Trails game in my opinion. It really just goes to show what the series can be when it's not obsessed with making you do meaningless fetch quests and just give the players what they want. Because I think this is the Trail series at its best. A game where you have a vast selection of characters to customize and use to take down a multitude of bosses for great gameplay rewards. And I find it to be such a shame that the game right after this is a return to form in the worst way possible. If anyone made it through all the hot takes to the end of the video, or even just clicked on the video at all, I just want to say thank you. Let me know your favorite and least favorite Trails game in the comments. If you did enjoy the video, feel free to like and subscribe. I'm planning on making all kinds of videos talking about games like this, and I'd love to share them with you. Or I have links in the description if you want to join my Discord or just follow me on social media. This has been Jake Giggs, and once again, thank you so much for watching.